Identify myself? Okay. Hi, I'm Chuck Joseph, and I am here to chat with some folks from what my understanding is, as part of the 300th anniversary, are going to be interviewing some of our senior citizens here in Hopkinton. And what I've been asked to do is to kind of set the stage or a frame of reference so that they have a historical context within which to formulate your questions. And that's what I'm going to try to do for a few minutes here. At 2013, if somebody was born in 1913, they'd be 100 years old. 1923, they'd be 90. 1933, they'd be 80. So I'm assuming we're talking about the furthest back that someone's birth date will go will be about 1925. So given that, I'd like to just kind of maybe provide a little background of 1900 to 1925, and then perhaps talk about what these folks would have experienced in Hopkinton during their lifetime. Prior to 1900, we were very much an industrialized town, primarily driven by the shoe industry, but not solely by the shoe industry. At one point, right around 1900, we were about 5,200 people. After 1900, there was a very rapid decline in population and in the character of the town. The commonly noted reasons for that were a series of 3 fires that were in these shoe factories and that were significantly involved in that decline. However, I think it would be erroneous to say that that was the sole purpose. My suspicion is that in the late 1800s, Hopkinton was at its peak in the 1880s. In the late 1800s, there was competition evolving as well, not only for the shoe industry, but for all industries. And there were probably multiple forces that were operating on or contributing to the economic decline of that industrial period. Nevertheless, the summation of those variables did result, after 1900, in a significant change in the character of this community. At 1900, right prior to that last fire, it was still a bustling economic community with a rail line, 3 rail lines, one from Westboro, one from Milford, and one going into Boston, that were essential to the industry in the community. Around 1907, I believe it was, up until about 1927, for a period of about 20 years, there were significant electric trolley cars that came again from those same 3 locations, Westboro, Ashland, and Milford. There are a number of photographs you'll probably look at which will show dirt roads in Hopkinton with rail lines in those dirt roads. Eventually, they become paved, but the rail lines stay in there. And then by about 1930, those trolley cars were disappearing or gone at that point. The railroads continued to run for quite some time, but nowhere near the capacity that they were experiencing prior to that. So the folks that you're going to be interviewing, assuming for a minute that they were born around 1930, would have been born into a very quiet community. Their parents would have remembered the period of the shoe factories and probably came here because of that. But their entire life would have been in a very rural, sleepy community. And it's important that you understand that the Mass Pike was not here, Route 9 was not here, Route 495 was not here, Route 85 was not here. So if you can look at a map and picture how you would get around this community from 1930 till say 1980, it was very different than what we see today. What sociologists refer to as interconnections didn't exist, or they were more difficult. To go anywhere was more difficult. Boston was a significant journey. And this was not an affluent town. The money, by and large, the money had left. So most of these folks grew up in a middle class or lower middle class, what we would refer to as a working class family. Many of them had parents that worked in Milford, possibly Westboro. Occasionally I would hear of somebody who had a parent that worked in Worcester, but they oftentimes did not travel back and forth every day. And no one worked in Boston and lived here. What is commonplace today was unheard of then, again, because the links were not there. The ability, the transportation links were not there. So at the end of the 1800s, in the 1890s, you have to remember this community experienced a metamorphosis. There was the construction of the new high school up at Carrigan Park. There was the construction of the town library. There was a construction of the Episcopal Church next to the library. There was a construction of the town hall. There was a construction of St. John's Church. None of those arose in a vacuum. They arose for reasons. And it's important to understand that Hopkinton for many years was a Protestant community dominated by either Episcopalian or congregational members of those churches. With the advent of the shoe industry in the 1850s, the labor that came over was poor Irish labor that was fleeing the potato famine, and thus the result of the Irish Catholic population in Hopkinton, which gave rise to St. Malachi's on Cedar Street, which later became St. John's on Church Street. So your folks that you're going to be interviewing will have some probably nostalgic memories of a quieter town that many people knew everybody, class size of 30 or 35 students in total. Most of the folks that I have spoken to of that age speak about having to do many things, that this was not a town in which the division of labor was as distinct as it would have been as in an urban setting. So someone who was a plumber may also have been the town surveyor, or many multiple roles. They wore many hats, and it was out of necessity that they did that. It will be interesting to hear what they have to say if you can pursue a line of inquiry where you ask them how and when, in their perception, things began to change. So some milestones to think about. Center School was a brand new state-of-the-art school in 1928. So that's probably where most of them went to elementary school. The middle school at that point would have been 1 Ash Street, which is today right behind the Doughboy statue. And then they would have gone to the high school up by Carrigan Park, which was built, I think, in 1896. So that would have been their 3-school system. Prior to Center School being built, there were 11 different elementary schools scattered throughout Hopkinton with nothing approaching an integrated curriculum. It was basically dependent upon which teacher was in which school, and you would learn what they felt like teaching you. And then you would gather together at the middle school, and then you would move on to the high school. So they would have experienced a very different public education. There were a number of farms in Hopkinton during the from 1930 to 1960. There were a fair number of mostly dairy farms that existed in Hopkinton. And I've met and spoken with a lot of people who are still alive today who grew up on those farms and worked on those farms and milked cows before going to school and so on. So you can imagine that their memories will be somewhat pastoral. They, for the most part, are not even aware that prior to them there was this great industrial period that occurred here where Hopkinton was on the cusp of becoming a city. And through many different variables, it just didn't happen. So that proceeds on. 1956 or 58, we build the new high school, what was then called the junior-senior high school, on the top of the hill at the highest point in the town, very visible location. Honey Pot Hill, on the top of that hill is what it was referred to. And that changed lives, because now the focus from the downtown area shifts a little bit up the street, about a half mile, 3/4 of a mile up the street, And today, of course, that's where we have 100 acres and 3 schools, and most of our children will identify Hopkinton as that's where they spent most of their time. That is not true for the generation that you're going to be talking about. I think it would be very interesting to talk to them as to whether or not they have memories of Hopkinton prior to Route 85 connecting to the reservoir. Because to me, most people who live in Hopkinton today cannot conceive of the town without that north-south route. And of course, 495 did not exist. So what were the north-south routes? Where did they travel? Most of the folks I've talked to have said they traveled over what is today Wilson Street, which goes up by the gas towers. Of course, there were no gas towers at that point. And Rafferty Road, which connects down to 85, did not exist. I actually remember when that was built. And the Hopkinton Reservoir did not exist. So it's kind of interesting to think that there was a road that ran right through where the reservoir is today, called Rock Road, and that's how most people got to Southborough. So a lot of kind of geographic markers will be interesting to chat with them about. Where did they recreate? What did they do for recreation? There are many people I've spoken to who talk about the middle school, which is right behind the Doughboy statue, the 1 Ash Street, was where they would have dances and where the gymnasium was. Other people who went to the old high school, Carrigan High School, the gymnasium was on the 3rd floor. So you would be on the 2nd floor and you would hear the gym classes above you. So there's a lot of kind of interesting memories of their childhood, which I'm sure will come out. You will probably also hear, and I think should pursue, lines of inquiry relative to how their families survived economically. I think that will be a really important aggregate of sociological data to find out, what did your dad do? Did you have relatives here? What did your uncles do? Do you remember where they worked? Did they always work there? Because part of what I think is fascinating is when a town undergoes as rapid and drastic a change as Hopkinton did in 1900, what happens to the economic base? How do these people, we know what happens after 1980. We know that once 495 gets here, and Interstate and Route 90 is built, that the history, not the history, the legacy of this town is pretty much written. You know what's going to happen. All of a sudden, you are at a critical crossroads, and it is only a matter of time before industry finds Hopkinton. Hopkinton becomes part of the great American suburb due to the automobile, and develops primarily after 1985. So we kind of have the last 30 years. I think that's a little easier to get a grip on, but it's that 1960 to 80 period that I think is fascinating, because there were rumblings of change. I came to Hopkinton in 1975 as a recent undergraduate to teach high school, and was shocked at the kind of rural vestiges that still existed here, like 4-digit phone numbers and many things like that. And many students who I taught had never been to Boston and had lived here in the 1970s. So there was a tremendous, there's been kind of this period, this rapid period of change from 1830 to 1880, and then into 1900, the decline from 1900 to 1925, the kind of big snooze from 1925 to 1955, 60, and then the acceleration from 85 till today. So I think if you can start to conceive of Hopkinton in those global terms, it'll help you in your deciding what questions are pertinent to the people that you are speaking to. I would speak to them a great deal about town government, because it has, I have the good fortune of working in about 17 towns in Metro West, and I know of no town that has as politically active a town meeting as Hopkinton has. And it always fascinated me as to why that started, how does that maintain itself, will it continue, etc. And you may want to speak to them a little bit about those things. You may want to speak to them about their churches, their respective churches, and what they know about them. as well as the infrastructure changes that they have seen in their life here. This is not the town they were born into. These are folks who used to put their cars up on blocks in the winter because you couldn't drive the streets. And when you think about the technological advancements that have occurred during their lifetime, it is staggering to see what they have seen, to kind of take a snapshot of what they have seen. And I think it would be interesting to ask them about their views of those changes. Whether or not, in very simplistic terms, were there any changes that you thought were good? Were there any changes that you absolutely believe were bad? Were they societal changes across our country, or were they specific to this particular community? And how do you see Hopkinton today in 2013? We're only 2 years away from our 300th. So how do you see that? You know, it's kind of interesting to think that I don't think there'll be anybody here for our 300th who was here for our 200th. So in some ways, we have to try to bridge that gap as best we can, and there is nothing like oral history. And if you start proceeding down a path where you think it's a tangent, but it's an interesting tangent, go with that tangent. It's going to take you somewhere that will be really interesting and probably end up being one of the most important parts of the interviews that you do with these folks. So I think that's the majority of what I want to say in terms of hopefully setting a little bit of a background for you. You should have a blast. It should really be fun to do. And remember, they're human beings, and they're going to tell you about Hopkinton through their individual lens that they have seen it through. And they all look at it through, and it's the summation of all those things that probably give us the most accurate picture of Hopkinton. So best of luck to you. Thanks.